Let me add my welcome. It's great to see you all here today, and we've got a fantastic panel to kick us off. But I want to start with a little audience participation. Make sure you've had your tea and coffee and are sufficiently caffeinated. So you'll have noticed that the titles for the sessions this time are these abstract words: resilience, infrastructure, governance, and disruption. And it struck me that three of those are clearly positive things. Resilience is good, governance is good, infrastructure is good. What about disruption? So I'd like a show of hands, please. I would like you to raise your hand if disruption has a positive vibe for you. Okay, that's about 40%, I'd say. And what about if it's got a negative vibe for you? Oh, well, we're optimists. Fantastic. Very positive start to the day. So that's the first session, and I'm not going to read out the biographies because they're in the programme, but we have fantastic speakers. Brittany Smith, who is Head of UK Policy and Partnerships at OpenAI. Emran Mian, who is Director General for Digital Technologies and Telecoms at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And Gina Neff, my colleague, who runs the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy here. So we're going to have about half the session for a conversation among the panel, and then the other half over to you. So start thinking about the contributions that you want to make, comments and questions. But I'm going to start with Brittany, if I may. So it's about a year since OpenAI rocketed public attention with ChatGPT. And we've seen everything from Daily Star headlines about psycho chatbots to news stories only yesterday about AI's capacity to spot cancer early and save lives. And I wonder if you can just kick us off by reflecting on your views of the public conversation that we're having around AI and the disruptions it might cause.
Sure. Firstly, thanks for inviting me to be here today. It's a real privilege, and it's nice to see so many people here, and hello to people online. As Diane said, I'm the head of UK policy at OpenAI. I started in October, so still a bit new and finding my way, but I've been working in AI policy for a long time, so throughout the panel may switch hats depending on the question. I think in terms of the disruption that we're seeing today, there are both opportunities and challenges in the way that Diane kind of just teed it up just now. I think there are reasons for optimism and reasons to be worried. In terms of some of the opportunities and things that I see that I'm super excited about, are around the possibilities for near-term benefits in a wide range of fields. We're seeing progress in fields like healthcare, agriculture, education, caregiving, advocacy, and these are all super exciting. So we just published a case study on our website of one that I think is especially cool with Lifespan, which is Rhode Island's largest healthcare system. And what they've been able to do is to use generative AI to simplify surgical consent forms. So they're able to take this dense medical legal jargon and make the text more accessible for patients to read. And what they're able to do is to use GPT-4 to improve patient outcomes by increasing health literacy, because more than half of adults in America are reading at or below a 6th grade reading level, which I don't know what that is in the British school system, but you're like 11 or 12 in 6th grade. And so what you're able to see in a situation like that is, and by the way, like they're able to mitigate risks of bias and hallucination by having GPT-4 do a first pass, and then a team of doctors and legal reviewers will do a second pass before something goes to a patient. And so what they're able to see is that with GPT-4, something that has been an entrenched problem for decades can now be solved within minutes. And that opens up so many possibilities for the way that generative AI can be used to improve patient outcomes. And so what I think that case study tells us is that there are going to be near-term benefits that offer us more data and more specificity for the kinds of policy conversations that we want to have about risks and mitigations and how to scale opportunities and increase public sector adoption throughout the UK economy. And I think some of the downsides, some of the challenges, things to be worried about, one that I've spent a lot of time working on is around democratic inputs. I think we have a hugely complex policy problem in front of us about how we increase public participation in AI governance. And I think it's interesting both as an empirical question around how we channel democratic inputs to improve model behavior. That's an area of active research for us. But then there are also interesting public engagement methodological questions about how we use methods like public deliberation workshops and citizens' juries at scale on questions around AI governance. A citizens' jury is incredibly expensive, small scale, slow to run. It's not fully representative in relative to the kinds of challenges and the kind of questions that we have, and for the kind of inputs that we want to channel to teams like Emran and other folks working in government about how we want models to behave, how we want them to be adopted and deployed throughout society. So I think democratic inputs is the kind of challenge that makes me excited. We did a citizens jury project with another job that I had that was really interesting, but it is going to be really, really challenging to figure that out. So hopefully that's a good start and gives us something to continue talking about.
You've set up Emran and Gina nicely, I think. So Emran, what's your perspective on the policy issues and the extent to which you see challenges or potential benefits from the technology?
Yeah. So going back to your kind of initial question that you asked the audience of, do we see disruption as a positive or as a negative? I think, what would it mean for AI to have a positive effect in terms of disruption? I think that's one of the things that sort of I'm trying to think about. And it seems to me there's kind of three ways in which AI in public policy terms can have a really positive disruptive influence. I think the first is in terms of driving growth and productivity. We haven't had the strongest story to tell on growth and productivity in the UK over recent years. And there's a lot, I think, to hope for in terms of the way that the transformative potential of AI, combined with competitive strengths that we already have in the UK economy, can really be a significant moment for us in terms of driving growth and productivity. And what I mean by competitive strengths in the UK economy is things like our creative industries, the fact that we're so strong in life sciences, the strengths we have in financial services and other professional business services. These are exactly some of the domains where we're already beginning to see really interesting applications for AI products and services. And Brittany kind of mentioned one or two in the health space just there. And so the combination of what AI can do and the combination of kind of UK competitive advantage, I think means that there's real scope for positive disruption in terms of our performance and growth and productivity. And the question for me as a policymaker and the question for HM government is how do we sort of lean into that change and help to make sure it happens and it's as broad as possible. The second disruption that I think I'm really interested in and that can be really positive is a disruption in terms of having really dynamic digital markets. As people here will know, we're currently in the process of taking legislation through Parliament to strengthen the competition regime in digital markets in the UK. And a big part of the reason for doing that is we want to see more dynamism in those digital markets. I think there are good reasons to hope that the way in which AI comes through in digital markets could drive a new generation of change in digital markets. I don't think we're seeing that yet necessarily. I think what we're seeing quite a lot of at the moment is some of the existing large tech firms adopting AI in a way that could be seen to consolidate their market position. But I think the possibility for AI to drive dynamism in digital markets is very much there. And from a policymaking point of view and from a achieving good public policy outcomes point of view, I think that is something we would focus on. And then the third thing is just the potential that AI has for driving improvements in public services. Again, health, I think, is a very good example of this. We want to see productivity improvements in health. We want to see improvements in the patient experience. We want to see improvements in key aspects of patient care, for example, cancer screening. And already we're beginning to see some really powerful applications of AI in terms of helping to make those things possible. I think there's a lot for us to do in government in terms of really leaning into that change, being really ahead of the curve and perhaps further ahead of the curve we have been on previous tech adoption in the public sector. But I think there's really good opportunities for us to bring AI through into public services and to do that in a way that from the very beginning has the trust of citizens and of users, is transparent to citizens and users. And that will be critical, I think, to being able to drive wide-scale adoption and the positive benefits of disruption.
A lot there that we'll pick up later. But both of you have raised points I'd like Gina to comment on about the public's role in all of this, either, as Emran was just saying, or Brittany's point about deliberation and citizens' juries and so on. What's the role of the public, Gina?
And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's really quite an honor for me to join you today. I want to address first this question of disruption, and I was really impressed with the number of people for whom disruption is a positive resonance. One of the things that I think we think about when we hear the word disruption is popularized by Clayton Christensen, and this idea, how many of you know the Christensen definition of disruption? A few hands, right? So this idea that you have new entrants to any market who can put out a cheaper, worse product, disrupting the incumbents. And this is definitely, from the questions that we talked about before, this is not something that's on the table when we're talking about AI, right? We are potentially enriching and creating really established troves of data and compute that are at a scale that is unfathomable to new entrants, right? So we're quickly creating this ability that we're going to have a big gap in terms of who can enter these markets and play seriously. Another definition of disruption that I think is absolutely on the table and perhaps not addressed so much in the first two co-panelists is this idea that when we disrupt, we're this notion that something new comes in, that there's a whole host of institutional restitching that needs to be done. And I feel like I can say the word institution in a room like this and not scare the audience. But the idea that the norms, practices, rules, laws, ways we get things done, what social scientists call social institutions, really robust and slow to change, right? They help us get work done within our societies. And yet, what we're seeing with AI is we're seeing that disruption in that way, right? We're seeing disruption to what are our jobs going to look like? What's our education going to look like? What's our healthcare going to look like? What's our public sector going to look like? What's the family going to look like? We have all of these questions, right? Big questions around that social institutional factor. So, one of the things that I think we absolutely have to keep on the agenda, we absolutely have to bring into these conversations, is how are we readying societies to have the capacity to work well with these potentially absolutely transformative technologies, right? So dismissing them, throwing our hands up, being Luddites, that's not going to work. But nor is simply saying, well, let's just let the market kind of figure this thing out. And that's because of these two dual ways of thinking about disruption, right? One, we have a situation where we are going to have some really hard choices and challenges about what our digital markets are going to look like. And two, we have a real serious societal conversation to have around what we want our new digital society to look at. So let me tell you just briefly a couple of things that I'm thinking about and doing in that. So first, in terms of that, how do we keep innovation sparking in a moment when we have such large capacity needed to build and play in these markets? One of the hats I wear is to help lead in Responsible AI UK, which is a £33 million investment from the UK government on how we can be the network and ecosystem for the UK and beyond around how we make responsible AI. With the Bennett Institute, we've been thinking through these questions around what would UK policy around generative AI be? And to that extent, we have a report out that you can find now on AI policy for generative AI, and we'll have a report this spring on AI policy and IP, a question that is of course of interest to many. And then finally, I think we have enormous work for people like those in the room to be doing around the kinds of capacity building, getting society ready for these potentially disruptive changes. And that is things like, how are we doing lifelong learning, reskilling, and upskilling to be ready to prepare to work with these new technologies? How are we creating new kinds of capacity in our labor markets to ensure that these changes are additive and helping to bring people to productivity? I don't think that's a straightforward answer, right? I think we have a lot of work to do there. Happy to talk more about that. And how are we getting organizations ready for this journey? So one of the hats that I wear as a researcher is having spent 15 years following the digital transformation in large-scale building construction. Not the first industry we think about when we think about innovation and change, but absolutely what is fundamental for change in that sector were people at the coal face of the introduction of these technologies. They were the ones who both understood the sector, understood the tasks that needed to be done, understood the work, and got the innovation done. They were the ones that negotiated innovation in the name of the book that my co-author and I just finished this week writing. I am so happy it is Friday. So with that, I'll just wrap up and say, we have to keep our eyes on the prize. There's so much work to do, yes, in terms of where the technologies are going to go, but in terms of policy, in terms of societal readiness, in terms of organizational and business readiness, there's an extraordinary amount of work that we've got to do within the next 2 to 3 years in order to make sure that these changes disrupt in the right way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gina. So I'm picking up a possible tension between your view about digital markets and Emran's view about digital markets. So Gina, you emphasize the scale that's needed to enter in generative AI, but Emran, you were quite optimistic about the possibility that this would actually tackle some of the market power that we see in digital markets. So have a conversation with each other about that. How are we to judge this debate between the two of you?
So I obviously recognize the challenge that Gina was describing. I think especially at the foundation tier, there's advantages that come from being able to pool very large amounts of data and being able to combine that with very large investments in compute, obviously sort of reinforces market position or means you need access to a lot of capex in order to be able to operate at the foundation tier. All that said, I think we are seeing a lot of improvements we're seeing a lot of algorithmic improvement going on. We're seeing some really interesting, powerful open source models out there. And I think what we are probably increasingly going to see is not necessarily a move away from very broad LLMs, but complementing very broad LLMs with kind of much narrower models, which, yes, of course, still require data and compute, but perhaps in more manageable quantities that you have a wider range of market players. So I think kind of the outlook on the foundation tier is not yet set, and I think there's some reasons to think that there'll be, there is dynamism there, and there will be more dynamism in future years. And then I think in the application tier, there's loads of scope for dynamism. Kind of Brittany talked about some of the ways in which at the foundation tier, you may well be using, an OpenAI model or another proprietary model or open source model, but you're building an application on top of that. And I think we're seeing already massive dynamism in that part of the market, and I think we'll continue to see more.
I think on that point, we would absolutely agree that, especially if we look at the UK can be a leader in responsible AI at the application tier. So this idea that the very large foundation models, maybe those ships have sailed in terms of what we get in terms of national capacity in the UK. But in terms of being able to support development in responsible AI, what we see is the UK certainly punches above their weight in any index of AI development. So many rankings, I'm literally waving my hands. Any rankings, we have to take with a grain of salt. But the UK is often placed third globally in terms of AI development. If you add in responsible AI, right? If you add in the work that is around ethical, safe AI development, if you add that in, then the UK is clearly in either the number 1 or the number 2 spot in the world. So we're doing more in terms of making sure that we develop safe, ethical, responsible AI vis-a-vis the capacity that we have in the economy. That's absolutely amazing news for the development and the application level, right? We actually think that's a key place where the UK will be a global player. What do companies, what do SMEs and startups need? What do they need in order to play in that space? And they need a bit of certainty, right? And right now, some of the questions around intellectual property and questions around safety and reliability of content in LLMs is not quite there yet. It's getting there, but there are roles for government and others to play to assure that we can spark that kind of diversity. And so I do think it's possible. I think, recognizing that that's the strategic advantage that could be in the tech sector in this country, I think gives a really great space for, people like you.
Yeah, and look, I think I very much agree with that. And just to kind of take an example to sort of show that agreement, one of the things that the UK is very good at, thinking about kind of creative industries is advertising, let's say. So kind of using a multimodal model to create advertising for a range of businesses, including small businesses, is an area where you would expect UK businesses to be very competitive. And we're already seeing some interesting examples of UK advertising businesses, whether existing ones or new ones, who are beginning to use multimodal models to do exactly that. But when it comes to selling what they're doing, selling their product or service, they're exactly rubbing up against some of these issues where clients are asking questions about the IP that is inherent in the product that they're providing, and about some of the wider regulatory environment. So these are absolutely issues that we need to keep working on. We've tried to kind of make some progress on them in the policy document that we published early this year. So I'm kind of pleased to hear you say, Gina, that you feel like we are moving forward a bit. That isn't necessarily the assessment we get from everyone, but there's definitely more for us to do.
My center, the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, will be helping to launch a campaign around what an AI and employment bill would look like for the UK. And what does this have to do with sparking innovation? Well, if we think about the UK's regulatory approach to AI, it has been, in this government, it has said that it will be with the regulators, that we have a very robust regulatory framework and well-developed and highly capable regulators, and so we can regulate AI across different things. So working with the Trades Union Congress and a wide group of stakeholders from all the major political parties, we spent 9 months drilling down into UK labor law. What does UK employment law say that we need to make fit for purpose for the generative AI moment? And the answer is not straightforward. The answer actually is we need to kind of go back and find some of those places where we need to make sure that employers are being held to account for their rights and responsibilities in the employment relationship, and employers are not being held liable for every single thing their software vendors do. So, for example, if an employer wants to bring on board an AI system in the hiring process, where is an employee or potential employee's place for liability? Where would they go for recourse? And that's not actually clear in existing law, right? The employer might not be able to be held to account. They could simply say, well, this was the software's fault. Stop me if you've heard that before. Oh, the software didn't work, therefore, our management system, our terrible system of identifying fraud within our organization has gone awry. So for companies to be able to develop those applications and to be able to sell them into market, they need to have a mechanism that they understand where their liability ends and the employer's liability begins. And that's one of the things that we're saying would actually be great for everyone. It'd be great for the employment relationship. It'd be great for employees. It'd be great for the companies that are going to develop the software that's going to let employers do their job with more efficiency. On the public sector side, my slight caveat emptor there would be, digital change is really hard. It's really hard. If it's hard for some of the biggest global, multi-billion-dollar engineering and construction global conglomerates in the world, right? If we're talking about the 5 biggest global concerns in the world, and they found a 15-year journey that they have not gotten this thing right, that they thought would increase productivity and eliminate jobs, they haven't been able to do that yet. Wow, you want to get this done in 6 months in public sector? That's not going to happen. So it's going to be a longer process, and it may not be the process that it actually sparks different kinds of, or less work. It may be like Brittany's case that she brought in, where there's new kinds of services that can be offered. There's better kinds of information. There's better services. There's better connected to customers and clients.
Brittany, Gina's just made a very powerful case for regulatory clarity and certainty. There's often a perception that big tech is against regulation full stop. And I have to ask you what your view is about that case that Gina just made. And also, what's your ask to Emran sitting next to you for the UK policy?
Sure. So I think we have been quite clear that regulatory clarity and regulation in general, especially in a way that incentivizes AI safety, is good for us and is good for everyone. And so we don't have the typical line that you would expect that's, please, don't look our direction, please, let's keep hands totally off. I think that is definitely not the best pathway forward for us. And so what you see in the government's response to the AI regulation white paper, for example, I think makes a lot of sense. So they're saying, look, we have existing regulatory authority and capacity that needs to be expanded to engage properly on AI. Let's please double down and do this. I think that makes sense, while also in parallel exploring whether that leaves gaps. And where we may need new powers, new authorities, new offices in the future, new binding regulations in the future that help us have a more comprehensive approach to safety more generally. And so I think that really resonates with us and supports us in being a responsible player in the UK and globally. I also think more generally that something I think that doesn't always come through as clearly with OpenAI is that we're not a big tech social media platform. We were founded in 2015 as a nonprofit. Our mission drives our work. We put our mission before profits. We do not have an ads-based business model. We don't serve ads. We don't collect user data. We don't turn around and sell that data. Our goal is not to sell the most of anything. We are a mission-based nonprofit and governed by a nonprofit today. And so again, that informs our approach to regulation too. And I think that more clarity is a good thing for us. So.
Thank you. I want to turn to the economy next, and here again there's another tension. So reflecting what Gina was saying about the difficulty of adopting digital tools, there's economic research, including some that we've done with Productivity Institute partners, showing that only the top 5% or so of companies have been able to use not even generative AI, but previous digital tools to increase productivity. So there's something inherently difficult about using it. On the other hand, there's a debate about, oh my goodness, it's going to take away all the jobs. And a concern about particularly professional types of jobs, advertising, the sorts of things that the UK is good at. So how are we going to navigate this kind of debate? I mean, Gina, you're quite skeptical from the sound of it about the potential for the productivity gains that Emran was talking about in his introduction.
I think we have work to do to get to the productivity gain. So this research falls into a long line of work around what happened with the first wave of World Wide Web internet technologies, right? So Robert Gordon, for example, quite skeptical, the economist Robert Gordon, quite skeptical that we've seen of how long it takes to get processes to in place for companies to realize those productivity gains. Listen, it's early days with generative AI. We already have seen that the best gains are happening from both skilled workers who can really supercharge their work, and from workers at the least skilled workers who can come up to the middle. But for these technologies to really change how people and companies are working, they're going to need to be able to be targeted on very specific data, data that's very close to the task, data that's very close to the work that's at hand. So in the history that I've looked at in terms of construction, the idea was that an automated tool to automate a process of construction planning would eliminate lots of construction planning jobs. And instead, the construction planners, surprise, surprise, they found out new ways to sell better services using those technologies. So yes, they automated one of the hardest and most, one of the dullest parts of their work. But in the process, they were able to offer their clients something that was much more of benefit to those purchasers of construction services. I think, what we know from the best economic data at the moment, OECD, the International Labor Organization, and others, shows that tasks are going to radically change at work. So we know tasks are going to change, they're going to change quickly. We don't necessarily think that there's going to be a net job loss. In fact, there will be a net job gain out of generative AI and this wave of AI. So I think what that means for me as somebody who really deeply cares about work and the future of work and workers, we have to get people ready to be able to harness those benefits at the point of play, at their point of their laptop, at the point of what they're doing. I'm not so much worried about creative work, and maybe I truly hope these words won't come back to haunt me, because what it takes to delight people is being able to recognize what is new and surprising in a particular situation. And what we're really good with generative AI is recognizing what's predictable. And predictable comedy, predictable advertising, predictable content, that's just not going to play. And in fact, the research that my PhD students are doing and others are showing that when you go now out to creative professionals and you show them things of content, they gravitate towards valorizing, right? They're placing more value on things that look handcrafted, that look made by human. I think we're going to change our aesthetic slightly, and we're still going to see that delightful content coming from people.
Can I pick this up in terms of the conversation we were just having about public sector adoption? Because I think that you're exactly right. And we get questions all the time about how is AI going to transform the economy? And this conversation is happening, the way I see it is up here in the clouds about it's happening tomorrow, 6 months from now, the economy is going to be totally transformed and there's going to be radical disruption and all this growth. And I think when you look at, people said the same thing about self-driving cars 5 years ago. And now it's just kind of like a goofy taxi that you take around San Francisco and people aren't really pursuing it as much anymore. And I think self-driving cars is amazing, but everyone 5 years ago would have thought that it would be everywhere by now, and it's not. And so I think there is a huge gap between the rhetoric that we have about the degree to which AI is going to transform the economy and unlock all this productivity and growth and disruption, and the real reality of what the capabilities are right now, and the difficulty of getting those capabilities into the public sector in a safe and efficient way. And so I think one of the things I keep harping on about, and maybe I'll have to write it myself, or maybe somebody here will be inspired to write it, is I really am keen on sort of doing more homework to document this pathway between research breakthrough to product, to scale, to effects. That, I think, is still so obscure as it relates to AI. The examples that cross my path that I see about the way that AI is being used in the public sector in the UK are so small and pilots, and that's good, that's where you start. But I think there's just so much more to uncover and in an empirical way between that pilot and the kind of transformation that people are expecting to see and that they are really quite worried about as well.
So let me give a quick example from my former profession and one from my current profession. So I originally trained to be a lawyer, and I think one of the very interesting things that's happening amongst UK legal firms is very quick adoption of AI. And they're, of course, absolutely not doing that because they think it's going to reduce their revenues as a law firm or reduce their size as a law firm. They're doing it to create legal documents more quickly, to do due diligence more quickly, exactly because they think that by doing that, they can offer legal services to a wider range of clients. and to a wider range of transactions. Lots of firms do not yet access high-quality legal advice because of the cost of it. And so the adoption of AI in legal services could very well mean that we see access to legal services being broadened to a much wider range of firms. I would say that's a good thing as a former lawyer. Maybe not everybody would agree. But I think it's really interesting to see kind of what productivity improvement in law could look like. Then in the public service, and, you know, I'm a policy professional, and I'm really interested in how we can use AI to improve policy processes. And one of the obvious places where we can do it is when it comes to analyzing consultation responses. We publish consultations all the time. We get very broad responses to them. There's a senior parliamentarian that I can see in the audience who I think as Secretary of State will have been told several times it's going to take us X long, Secretary of State, to analyze the consultation responses here, and that can be frustrating. And it holds up and slows down policy processes. Well, if you can deploy AI together with expert policy professionals, you can do that a lot faster. And that gives you a really interesting choice as a set of policymakers and as a set of ministers, which is you can either then ask those civil servants to do something else, or you can do more consultations. So you can become more consultative in how you go about making public policy. And that's a really exciting and interesting choice that I think AI opens up for us through the productivity improvement that it will drive.
I'm going to turn now to the audience. I've got a long list of other things I'd like to ask you about, but I need to be fair and turn to the audience. I think we've got a couple of roving mics, Tola and Blossom. Thank you very much. And I'll do the usual thing of taking the questions in clumps of 3. So first one, Blossom, if you could scoot down here to Katie.
Hello. Sorry. Yes, I'm Katie Thornborough. I'm an executive councillor here in Cambridge leading on planning and infrastructure. We're finding that AI is disrupting delivery of homes where grid capacity and water need to be rationed, and this has happened outside of London. How can Cambridge lead in being a sustainable AI city so that we ensure that this does not happen here?
Another couple of questions. So right next to you there. Let's go there.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, I'm Gavin Oldham. I'm fellow commoner in King's College, and I'm also behind the SHARE project. Just under a year ago, I asked ChatGPT this question. If you are going to use my data and my creativity to create wealth in the business that owns you, should that business issue an equity stockholding to me so that I can share in that wealth which I have made possible? Now, there are about a conversation which went to about 6 different iterations. I won't take you through that. But amongst that, ChatGPT did say, that's a very thoughtful and visionary perspective. And they ended up giving me the email of somebody in Microsoft who basically would continue the conversation because they said that they weren't entitled to actually issue shares. I understand this. Now, Dr. Heloise Grief here from Oxford, but she's working with King's College, Cambridge, is researching stock for data, which we believe is a way of introducing billions of people across the world into sharing the wealth creation which AI generates. And so I'd like your reflections on that. And I'd like to add a secondary question, which is this, and it relates to IP and copyright, which is that rather than actually work with a system of copyright, which is 300 years old, it was actually the beginning of the 18th century that copyright legislation started to be formed. Is it not time that we overhaul copyright law completely, recognizing that people like the New York Times are actually intermediaries? They're not actually the owners of copyright. The owners of copyright are humanity. They're all of you. They're all of us. They're all of us across the world. And so actually, is there not a very strong case for complete overhaul of copyright law so that it actually enables everybody to share in the wealth creation that you're making possible? Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name's Halima Khan. I'm an affiliated researcher here at the Bennett, and I work on public service innovation. My question is around the possible impacts on the labour market. So you've given us some great examples of where these kind of technologies may complement existing labour. I guess anticipating as this sort of technology grows, potentially sort of greater impacts on the labour market. There's work by Professor Danny Roderick at Harvard on the idea of employment-friendly technology. So I guess I'd be interested in your response to that perspective, and in particular, whether if we are sort of thinking that employment-friendly technology might be valuable, does that really only have implications at the point of deployment, or are there implications further upstream in terms of technology development, perhaps linking, Brittany, to your point about public participation? Thank you.
We'll come back to the floor, but let's start with those three. And I don't want to assign questions to people, so pick up on whatever you would like. Brittany, go first.
Sure, okay, I'll take the copyright question, which will potentially be an unsatisfactory answer, but let's see. Firstly, I'm delighted to know that you're using ChatGPT. Thanks. You'd be surprised the number of people who are angry with us but don't actually use it. So I think that's interesting. Secondly, I do think that these are really interesting questions about how to create a sustainable mechanism for the exchange of value. And we don't have a single answer, and I don't think that we should be the one to have the single answer, right? Because it's not just a question of OpenAI. OpenAI might be like the biggest or most obvious player, but there are lots of other competitors out there, including open source models. So on this point, I think it's really good to create. What I want to create is a mechanism by which people can exchange really radical policy ideas and channel those feedback to us, because this is a debate, we were just saying backstage, that this is a debate that I think has been entrenched and boring for quite a while and goes back way before AI. Really, we talked a little bit about Napster and LimeWire, and that people sit around the table, like the IPO working group, for example, like just fell apart, right? And they were meant to be working out a path forward between sort of people training on AI data and rights holders and creatives, and it went nowhere. And so there doesn't appear to be a space or a mechanism by which we can say, hey, here's like a radical new idea. What do people think about this, and is this reasonable? And then ship it over to Emran's team to actually run it down. So I'm super keen for the ideas. I'm not gonna respond to whether you should have shares in OpenAI potentially, but yeah, I think that this is a really entrenched debate, and those kind of ideas are really, really powerful and really good.
So let me start with the IP question as well. I think I'm not yet convinced that it's time to upend the intellectual property approach that we've had, as you say, I think, for a very long time, or the fundamentals of it for a very long time. It has supported massive amounts of innovation, it has supported massive amounts of knowledge creation. I'm not yet convinced we're in a sort of paradigm shift that we ought to move to a completely different approach. That said, I think as Brittany refers to, we have been trying to work through these issues that are posed by the emergence of AI. We asked the Intellectual Property Office to convene a working group between AI developers and rights holders and kind of the creative industries. That working group has not yet been able to agree a code of practice for how we move forward. And so what we said in our policy document earlier this year is that we're going to have to reflect on the fact that they've not been able to agree a code of practice and think about whether we need to bring a different way forward. We haven't yet got another way forward, so that's something that kind of we're doing a lot of work on at the moment. So I say that to signal the fact that I think there is something really knotty and complex here. I think both conceptually and then in terms of implementing it. Because I think even implementing it will be really challenging in the same way as kind of previous disruptions, whether it's the kind of the music streaming one, or whether it was the invention of the library. Previous disruptions have also required us to kind of think really quite hard about how do you make it operational to share intellectual property and have rights holders get their due. I think we're probably at another moment where we're going to have to think quite hard, not just conceptually, but operationally, how do we make this work? So I don't want to shut down the possibility that actually we might end up with something that is quite a break from the past, but I'm not yet convinced that we need a break from the past, but we definitely need to do quite a bit more work on this. And of course, there's cases working their way through the legal system at the moment, which will be a very good test for whether our existing legal system on intellectual property can deal with some of these issues. I want to just touch on the sustainability question as well, which I think is a really important one. I think this is difficult because the kind of the technological innovation that we're talking about here is very energy hungry. And there's real challenges about sort of how do you ensure cooling in a way to manage energy and your kind of your trading off there. I think in the investments that we're making as a government in compute, we're trying to be really mindful about and really trying to incentivize good solutions on this. So we're asking quite searching questions of people that we might work with in terms of public investments in compute about what technical solutions they're looking at and what improvements they're looking at in terms of the energy efficiency of the infrastructure that they're looking to build. I think there's some really interesting, innovative stuff that is happening here, but I think it's something we need to keep pushing.
Thank you, Gina.
I will touch on the environment question, and then you've left me the economics question. So our center is working on what kinds of choices and challenges are we facing with the environmental impact of our digital ecosystem. And I don't think there's a straightforward answer, right? We're going to have, as societies, we're going to have really hard choices to make. Anyone who says we can have this twin revolution, right? The green net zero revolution and an AI transformation simultaneously is not facing those tough choices, right? We cannot continue developing AI at the pace it's going now and with the technologies, the infrastructure we have in place, meet our net zero climate goals, period, full stop. We are adding, in Europe, we are adding in terms of data center capacity, the equivalent of adding a Greece, the entire electricity grid of Greece, to our energy demands every year. That's not sustainable in a moment when we need to be fighting for net zero emissions. So hard choices have to be made. I don't know whether the cat pictures are the first to go. I'm team dog picture. Thank you, Sophie from Romania. If you don't know, go on the internet now and see we are with an internet star on this platform. But we do, and it's really coming to the communities that are facing this. So our center put out a report. One of my researchers has a recent article about democratic processes and making those choices. And one of the things we absolutely have to make sure is that communities like Cambridge are involved in making the choices around energy and water. And sometimes that's not been the case when localities, municipalities, provincial governments are negotiating with large tech companies about where they're siting their facilities. In terms of labor-friendly technologies, I'm going to just sort of raise that one and say, one of the hats I'm wearing is helping to lead something called the Digital Good Network here in the UK. And that's asking, how do we make digital technologies good for societies, for people, planet, communities, right? And yes, thinking about, what are technologies doing for employment and the labor force, but, what kind of digital future do we want? And that's a separate set of conversations. Conversations about sharing in the growth and value of societies are conversations about how we want people to share in those. Are we investing in education to an extent that helps build that capacity? That's a question. Are we sharing in the kinds of protections that will allow workers the freedom to experiment and play and take the time to reskill and upskill? Are we investing in the kinds of skills that are needed for 21st century society? Are we investing in the capacity to make sure that we're supporting our communities so they can be strong and resilient? I'm not a politician, but these are questions we absolutely, as societies, have to answer. So I think some of the conversations that we're having about AI give us that opportunity to say, what are we doing? Who is benefiting? How can we make sure that we are fighting for better better societies. And to that effect, we have a day of panels that are going to take up some of these key issues.
A common theme in that first batch of questions was actually how is everybody going to benefit from this technology? So it speaks to what Peter described as our mission statement in effect, which is the right kind of growth fairly shared, has to be sustainable, everybody has to benefit from it. So let's go for another round. I'm going to read one from online, so thank you, and then I'll come back to the room. So this question is, what is the role of the public and citizens in directing the future of AI in their day-to-day lives? Given the technicality of the discussion, how can we involve marginalised voices and places whose preferences aren't easily represented? So that's one. Tim at the back, I saw your hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Great discussion. I'm Tim Minchell from the Institute for Manufacturing. Just much of the discussion so far has been very much in the virtual, but can we just, I'd be very interested in the comments on the panel on the physical. So Gina, you're talking about the world of construction and issues of sustainability, but sort of two thoughts. One is this whole AI infrastructure relies on massive physical products being built. And we're seeing the disruptions happening there with the extraordinary growth of NVIDIA, the criticality of TSMC, and the effects that has geopolitically. So the comments on we need the physical infrastructure to do what we've talked about here. And then the second part is maybe a comment on how AI is being used to support improvements in the way we make things, the way we produce things. So that slight circularity to it. I'd welcome comments on those two thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. And another one. Oh gosh, there are so many hands. Let's go there at the back. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Diane. There's a lot of talk about productivity improvement. How do you think that might be reflected in the statistics that we observe?
That's my favourite subject. But I'm going to hand over to the panel.
I'm putting that question back to Diane. To Dame Professor, please. I want to hear your answer to that.
We'll come to that.
Okay, robotics. I'm going to talk about robotics. That's a great question, right? We are talking about real stuff in the real world and lots of it. As anybody who has watched what has happened in chips development over the last 18 months can attest. Fortunately, here in the UK, we are really good in robotics research. And with my hat from Responsible AI UK, I can say that one of the things we need to make sure we really keep our eyes on in this country is assuring that we're not simply allowing AI/ML, we're not simply allowing the kind of digital we're not losing sight of our starting point around the absolute capacity, world-leading capacity that we have in robotics. I think based on my long time spent with construction workers, over a decade and a half, I will say a couple of things. Construction workers aren't going to go away anytime soon. I don't think care workers are going away anytime soon. And every time I see one of these tech bros who say, the end of work, I'm like, dude, you don't have a kid yet, do you? You don't have aging parents yet, do you? We have a lot of work, productive work that has to happen in societies. One of the things that I would recommend for this country is we absolutely, positively need to upskill at the level of vocational education. At the coal face of people working in skilled trades and being digitally enabled is where we can make real productivity changes happen. That's not a conversation that we've had. We've also not had a conversation around a national strategy for the economy vis-a-vis AI, right? We've spent the last year in this country talking about AI in a very lofty way, and we're not talking about how to grow the economy. We're not talking about what we need to do to rebuild, reskill, upskill, and get people ready to take these jobs. Anyone who's trying to hire someone at the moment who has skilled trade plus digital they're all complaining they can't fill those roles. We need to solve that problem first.
I wonder if you can pick up on the kind of geopolitical aspect that that Tim touched on, because you were talking earlier about having just made a trip to China and getting that perspective.
Yeah, I think what I'd say on the kind of the geopolitical dimension and kind of the question around semiconductors and chips is, I think first of all not to, and I'm sure you weren't doing this, but to kind of remember and not to underplay some of the capabilities that the UK does have in this respect. Okay, fine, we don't have, you know, a kind of fabrication capability such as exists in Taiwan, but we do have some real strengths in aspects of semiconductors. And we have some real strengths in chip design, obviously. And I think kind of making the most of those is really important. That's something we're really interested in as a government. We've got a strategy for semiconductors. We're investing significant amounts of money through R&D to further that strategy. And the other really important part of that is going to be kind of the partnerships that we craft as the UK with other like-minded countries. So we're doing that through the G7. Last week, we also signed up to the EU's joint chips undertaking. So as a consequence of Horizon Association, there are other partnerships that we are now able to make with the EU, and coming in on the chips undertaking was the latest one. So I think kind of, you know, I think that's what I'd say about the kind of the geopolitics of this. I think it's about recognizing what our strengths are as the UK and deciding who we're going to collaborate with in order to make the most of those strengths and complement the strengths of other people. I then just want to touch on the question that was asked online about people's engagement with these tools themselves. And I think that is a real challenge, because lots of AI products and services are extremely technical in nature. And I think we do need to do a better job of making that transparent to people and allowing people kind of some gripping points in terms of how they engage with products and services. I think that's especially important when we talk about public sector deployment. So we have now said that it is mandatory to use the algorithmic transparency recording standard for central government use cases, because we think it's really important to explain the process by which those algorithms are being used in public decision making, and for people to be able to look at that and scrutinize that. And that hasn't consistently been the case on previous use cases. And I think we're really interested in how do we kind of see that happen more broadly across the public sector. And again, I think we have some tools that we can use to do that. You know, every public sector authority is under a public sector equality duty. I personally find it kind of often quite difficult to see how you can satisfy your public sector equality duty without having gone through some of those very same steps to think about how the algorithm that you're deploying is kind of what bias or discrimination might it display, and how have you countered for that or assessed for that. So I think there's quite a lot to go at here. I think we've done some of the right things, but I think there's quite a lot more for us to do.
I know you've thought a lot about this. Yes, go ahead.
I want to answer that question too. I'll answer it in a slightly more personal way, because before this job, I spent the vast majority of my time working on and writing and advocating against the present-day harms that AI systems cause. So I'll just take my current work hat off for a moment to say, you know, I think it doesn't go without saying that we need to work very, very urgently on understanding, preventing, and remedying the harms that present-day AI systems, narrow AI systems, are causing. I don't know if anybody here has been sort of at the whim of a faulty facial recognition system you've been falsely accused by a crime, you've been applying for public welfare benefits and been told, well, I don't know what to do, the computer says, no, I can't give it to you, and you can't pay your light bill, or you don't get cash benefits that week and you can't eat. I mean, these are real examples, these are real scenarios of public sector adoption that has gone wrong in other countries. And so for so many people, the worst case scenario of AI is not some speculative far future science fiction thing. It's already their lived reality. They are experiencing catastrophic risk already today. And when we continue to see those examples in front of us while talking in vague terms about potential future benefits and productivity gains and economic transformation, we are perpetuating historic patterns of technological advancement that happens at the expense of vulnerable people. And so I think this is a huge mess. And it prevents us from having the kind of really fun and imaginative conversations about the way that AI can transform our lives. And so my positive vision for AI and democratic inputs for AI and all of those things are informed by that work. In a job before this, I was a part of a civil rights coalition that was presenting to a government. They asked us to come in and help them understand how some of the issues, they knew there were issues, but they didn't know what they were, about using AI to detect fraud in the provision of pandemic welfare benefits. There'd been all of this theft and fraud and waste, and they wanted to use AI to work that out, but they knew that there was something that they should be thinking about. And so we gave them this whole presentation about, if you make a mistake, and say that someone has committed fraud against the federal government, and they haven't, that will destroy their lives. They will not be able to eat, they won't be able to, so they're like, okay, fine, but they're just exasperated. They're like, well, can we use AI for anything? And I think it's a really telling question, and it clarified so much for me, because they're not asking, how can we use AI to help people thrive? How can we use AI to say, okay, well, you're on these 3 benefits, and so we predict that you might miss out on this new one, also based on the fact that you live in a rural location, which we know doesn't have broadband. They're not using AI to stitch things together across government and deliver benefits to people that they are actually entitled to receive. People aren't criminal, like people, assuming that poor people are criminals, I think is really not ideal, not ideal policy. So I have a kind of personal sort of political, I think, vision for the positive future of AI, and this is why I think public inputs and democratic inputs are so important, because it's really not as much about the technology actually, but about rethinking what is the purpose of government relative to people who need things, and how are they going to use technology in order to better deliver those things that people are actually entitled to receive. And so you will sometimes, I think maybe but not so much now, but previously have found me in the op-ed pages of The Guardian trying to make the case that poor people aren't criminals and they shouldn't be assumed to be committing theft when they are asking for benefits. And we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about public sector adoption of AI. So hopefully that at least partially answers the question about interactions between the government and marginalized people that are mediated by powerful algorithmic systems.
Very inspiring. And this is very non-standard, but I'll answer one of the questions, and that's the measurement question. Work I have done indicates that we're not measuring well the decline in prices associated with the new technologies on telecoms, on computing, which I did with Lucy, sitting in the front row here. And that means that we are, to some extent, not measuring the real output of the economy and productivity of the economy in these sectors. The caveat is that it doesn't all mean that actually the productivity problem goes away or the poverty problem goes away, and we've seen those figures published just yesterday. And so, although technology is going great in terms of that basic cost decline and output increase, people are not able to eat, and we've got the environmental issues. So thinking about progress in the round is a complicated story, which is a prelude to saying that, like Gina, I handed in a book recently, which is all about these measurement questions, and hopefully will be out in 2025. So if you're back next year, we can talk about it then. Okay. We've got time for another round, I think, before coming back to the panel for any final reflections. But they're going to have to be very quick fire. So 2 together over here. And keep them short, please. Otherwise, I'll run out of time and do a very bad job chairing.
Jeff Matsu from CITFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. I had a question regarding public services, frontline public services, and this disruption and how it can be embedded at pace, given the quite substantial skills and capital investment that seems to be required. How do we kind of get frontline services to adopt this? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you hand the mic to Arthur next to you?
Hi, my name is Arthur Humans. I'm doing the MPhil in Public Policy here in Cambridge. I think it's great to hear industry call for regulation of AI. In your view, does the government currently have the material and epistemic resources it needs to effectively regulate AI? And if it does not, what's the role of industry in ensuring government has access to these resources? Thank you.
Thank you. And one final question right there.
Hi, my name is Esme Wilcox. I wear many foresight and social change hats. Gina, I was really struck by your articulation at the start about the twin challenges of the social systems and digital markets governance. And panellists have talked about a number of the social challenges, but I'm very curious about how do you see that government is developing its capability to answer those two together?
Thank you. You've got 2 minutes each, so pick up the questions, anything you like in the questions, and also any final reflections you have before the coffee break. Brittany, you start.
Sure. I'll take the question from here about industry and about whether governments have the resources that they need to regulate us. I think I'll give you 2 contrasting answers. One is that yes, I think they do. The UK government in particular has started this AI Safety Institute, which is, I think, the leading effort in the world to get more technical capacity in government to do evaluations on models, on frontier AI models. And we're very supportive of that work. We think independent evaluations of our models are very important and that we shouldn't be grading our own homework, as it were. And so I think there are lessons that other governments can learn from the UK about how to get that technical expertise situated in government, and then to deploy that not only as an independent evaluator and auditor of our work, but also as policy expertise within other parts of government. But the flip side of that, I think, is that no, I think the other governments are trying to set up safety institutes. They're trying to do other things to get technical expertise and technical capacity into government, and it's hard. It's expensive. There are obviously limits to how much civil service can pay, and folks in industry make more than civil servants do. And so there are lots of, I think, mitigating forces that are keeping governments from being able to increase their capacity to regulate effectively. But again, this government announced, I don't know why I'm mentioning your job so much, but additional funding for regulators. There was, I think, £10 million announced to help regulators expand their capacity to engage on AI issues. And so it's a bit of a back and forth. I think the AI Safety Institute is a good example of something that could be scaled to other governments and that they should do and that we welcome. But at the same time, I think the issue is much, much deeper about how all of this expertise that exists, not just actually in industry, but also in academia, can be channeled into government so that they can be effective and that they can be in the know, as it were, on some of the latest capabilities.
Thank you. Emran.
Yeah, so let me take say a couple of things about sort of public sector capabilities, as it were. I think the first one, in terms of kind of adopting AI into public services, I think probably the key thing is going to be to make choices about which opportunities to go at. I think trying to kind of deploy across too wide a range is going to mean we won't have sufficient expertise or capability to make a success across such a broad front. So I think we really need to pick some targets to begin with. That's the approach that we're taking. And then in picking those targets, I think we absolutely must not neglect the kind of taking the citizen with us or taking the public service user with us on that journey. I think there can be a tendency sometimes when you do digital change in any large organization that you focus on the technical bit and you don't focus on the user bit. And that's something that I think kind of large organizations are often guilty of. So I think that's the key to kind of how we get it right in terms of public sector delivery. And then in terms of kind of the wider capability, I mean, Brittany's just talked about kind of what we're trying to do in terms of the AI Safety Institute. And kind of that ultimately stems from a kind of the insight that the science around AI safety, what does it mean for a frontier model to be safe, is in its infancy at the moment. So to regulate for safety is really difficult at the moment because it's really hard to define sort of what would it mean for a frontier AI model to be safe. And that's why we've made the decision to invest really hard in that safety capability and to do that kind of fundamental research, if you like, working with the firms, OpenAI as well as others, on kind of understanding, on doing a set of evaluations and kind of trying to set a better understanding of what safety looks like. I think I recognize the challenge that Brittany describes in terms of bringing people who have this expertise into government. We don't pay what large tech firms pay, but it is really interesting to see just the extent of the pay cut that some people are willing to take to come and do this work. I think for the same sort of reasons that someone like myself decides to be in public service, I think I'm seeing lots of people with tech expertise making the same choice at the moment because they can see that we're at a bit of a threshold in terms of some really important public policy choices needing to be made, and they want to be on this side helping to get those choices made.
And we absolutely, this may be my most controversial point, we absolutely cannot have the debate about what kind of future we want set by the tech companies. So right now, there's been a little bit of throwing up hands saying, you know, those guys and tech companies, they have all the answers because they're really good at tech. The British AI researcher Stuart Russell has talked about this metaphor of asphalt. You know, imagine asphalt engineers were so good at their job, they came in and they said, we can tell you exactly where asphalt should go because we're really good at asphalt. That has been how we've had the debate around where and how AI will be used in society, and that absolutely should stop, right? We need to have governments stepping up and saying, this is what we want for the future of growth, stability, for human flourishing in our jurisdictions, and recognizing that AI growth, AI change is challenging. This is not inevitable. This is not some sort of magic force that we have nothing and no power against. The UK is a leader in terms of thinking through how to regulate for strong markets. And we absolutely have the capacity to make sure that we're having those meaningful and sensible debates about what we want the future of our work, healthcare, education, public services to look like. And those are the conversations that I want to see in the next 12 months.
Well, what a great start to the day. So thank you all. Just hold it for a minute. There's going to be a coffee break now for half an hour, and so please get back and be sitting down by 11:45. So plenty of time to chat. Gina's centre, the Mindry Centre, and the Bennett Institute will be taking forward exactly this kind of work. So watch this space. And now you can thank the panel. Thank you.